Thanks for making LangChain. I think that's the first thing I want to say.
No, you explained it a lot better than I ever could. So we got to record that and get that as the official pitch.
All right, let's dive into this tool talk. LangChain. Actually, quick thing before we dive in. Heads up, we're going to be doing a large language models bootcamp in person in SF, where we talk about how to build LLM powered apps, best practices, and best tools. We'll almost definitely be covering and using LangChain at this event. There's going to be probably about 300 people there. We're also sponsored by folks like OpenAI, Modal, Weights and Biases. So it's going to be a good one. If you're in SF at that time or can be in SF at that time, you should come through. If you can't, stay tuned for future online versions of this content. I like to start these tool talks by asking, like, what problems might I have that LangChain would solve? And to start, large language models are extremely capable, right? This is the most exciting thing about them right now. They seem to be like just chock full of capabilities that we don't necessarily anticipate. And they are capable now of intelligently and controllably mapping text to text, arbitrary text. And that's a reasonable model of what computers and humans do. So you might seem attention is all you need. We're done. Just make OpenAI API calls and profit. That's a reasonable take. It's also the case that most things like, for example, REST APIs in web services are just maps from JSON to JSON. I represent state in a blob of JSON. I send it to somebody. They send me back a representation of state as JSON. And so it's like, oh, well, you're done. We have a way of doing this, but we still need frameworks in web development. We still need ways to structure this. So GraphQL, OpenAPI help with structuring these things, to say nothing of all the JavaScript frameworks. Once you start building stuff with language models beyond the scale of a single conversation with ChatGPT or a single unhinged search on Bing, you're going to want some way to organize your code and to like hook in tools. And so you need a framework. LangChain is going to offer that framework. And also, large language models operate only within effectively the limitations of their prompt. So what is being given to them at the time that you trigger a generation. And sort of no amount of high IQ can replace context for many tasks. And so now you have to manage the creation of that context. And for that, you're definitely going to want a framework. And then finally, large language models are very good at mapping what text is likely to follow other text, which allows them to represent pretty much any text-to-text map. But some of those maps, like a Python interpreter or a Google search, are not going to turn out well if you just directly hand them off to a language model. So I can give a Python program to a language model and ask it to simulate that program and return the output, or simulate the results of a Google search, but the simulation is not going to be particularly high fidelity. And the good news, though, is that we have high fidelity simulators of Python interpreters. They're called Python interpreters. And so we will often find ourselves in a situation where there's some like highly specific, highly precise text-to-text map that we want to hand off to a more like traditional approach. And so for that, we want to use the traditional programs, and we want to integrate that with the more loose and semantic kinds of maps that language models can provide. So now we've got this like interface between two very different types of programs, two very different types of text-to-text maps, and a framework or something to organize what we are doing feels very necessary. Hopefully I've sold you on the kinds of problems that arise that require an LLM programming framework, and LangChain is the first widely adopted LLM programming framework. One of the biggest wins for it is that it basically provides the abstractions you would probably invent yourself if you got around to actually abstracting them instead of just shipping stuff under tight deadlines. So abstractions over large language models, abstractions over prompts templating, abstractions over like even more abstract things themselves like memory and agency and tools. And it's just been my experience in the last, let's say, 6 weeks that every time I sit down and like start writing my own language model using program, I like come across some aspect of the workflow that needs some abstraction, needs some structure, and I write some like shitty version of it in 15 minutes, feel upset about it, and then like within a week find out that there's a LangChain feature possibly implemented just then that actually solves that problem. So one primary example of that would be integrations with tools that you want to use. So things like ways to store the sorts of high dimensional vectors that come out of language models and other neural networks. and integrations with data sources to help you build the sort of a very broad, big context that you can use to construct the local context that your language model will operate in its prompt. And they're literally growing and adding features faster than I can make slides. Like, there were some features announced last night when I first sat down to write this. They didn't have asynchronous execution of language model calls. They didn't have really any data connectors. Yeah, it was difficult to persist certain vector stores. And like all of these have been knocked down because this LLM programming framework, it's really been picked up by the open source community as like a really exciting project to work on. And now they're just like bringing in contributions from tons and tons of people. And because it's a framework, it has this huge surface area where they don't just need people who know a bunch of stuff about transformers. In fact, they don't need those people. What they need are people who know things about web application, about data sources and things like that. And so they can make use of contributions from lots of people. So if you're the type of person in this audience who has those skills and is interested in open source contributions, LangChain is a great target. So I wanted to do a demo. So I decided it would be appropriately meta to do a demo on how you can use LangChain to help you use LangChain. So let's dive into that. One of the emerging, like almost pet store, hello world examples for LangChain has become Q&A over documents. I got myself a nice little Jupyter notebook here where I walk through that. We'll do Q&A with Harrison once we get through this demo. The fundamental reason why people are interested in bringing in extra resources to language models is that without context, a language model is basically a Reddit simulator or an internet simulator, and that's not always super useful. So we get LangChain, we get OpenAI, we bring in LangChain's abstraction over OpenAI language models, and then we ask it, hey, what is LangChain? And it says LangChain is a blockchain-based language learning platform that allows users to learn languages through a decentralized network. And when I first saw this, I thought, oh, wow, what a funny hallucination. Turns out it's actually not wrong. There is something called LangChain that I found on LinkedIn that is, in fact, a blockchain-based tool for like learning languages and sharing translations. And they call out AI technology companies for unfairly stealing translation data and compensating people. Not wrong, actually. That is a correct answer to the question, what is LangChain? It's just not contextualized, right? That's not really what I wanted to ask about. And if I asked what are the like core utilities in LangChain, it wouldn't be able to answer. So the resolution is to create context that is smaller than the internet, but bigger than the and then subselect down at query time to the specific thing that a person is asking about. So if you want to do structured Q&A. So I did a quick scrape of LangChain's docs, not a full scrape. I just grabbed a hold of the top level domain of their read the docs. It looks kind of like this if you display just the raw, like the HTML with a little formatting. Use the Python Beautiful Soup library to parse out the HTML and pull out all of the links. So all the sort of like internal links on that first page. So I'm like getting a hold of a bunch of useful information from the internet. And this information might come from a database. In another case, there's all kinds of ways that this information might come about. It doesn't have to be a web page. It just has to be textual. And of course, people are working on multimodal things as well. So we get those, we pull them down again using requests. This actually takes a couple of minutes because I didn't want to be like try parallelizing things and risk like hitting rate limits, etc. So we grab that. There's a useful library that is integrated with LangChain called unstructured. So I used unstructured to pull out just the text from the HTML because the thing that we're getting when we just do like requests in Beautiful Soup is like HTML, this markup language, and not English. And we only care about the English for now. So we grab those and we get things that look like this. Welcome to LangChain. Large language models are emerging as a transformative technology, etc. We now have all these texts. Low key, the place where this kind of stuff should live is a database, like this context, this like broad context that's smaller than the internet that's relevant for your language model application should be living in a database. I have an example where I use MongoDB for this, but I actually am convinced now that probably something more standard like Postgres is probably the right place. So just to indicate how databasey this is, I just threw it into a pandas data frame here. So you can see you got your rows, you got your columns, you have interrelated pieces of data. Don't store it in like lists of dictionaries, store it in something more sensible. But this is just a demo, so we don't actually hook up to a database here. We've got our text. Now let's go back to using some LangChain tooling here. LangChain includes these text splitters that help you take text that's maybe longer than the size of your prompt and split it into pieces that are smaller than your prompt. And often you'll want multiple pieces of multiple documents to answer a question. Like you might need to check 3 doc pages to answer a question. And so you want actually to have things that are much smaller than a prompt, like maybe 1/10 the size of your context window as your chunks. They have a bunch of really nice tooling for this. For example, the tick token encoder, which is used for the tokenization for the OpenAI language models for many of them, that you can use it directly via LangChain to get chunks that like consume a specific number of tokens plus or minus. And that's incredibly useful for like knowing just how much of the prompt you're using. So that's this character text splitter where from tick token encoder that's inside LangChain. Would not have wanted to build that myself. Thanks to the LangChain folks for putting that together. So we get subchunks of documents here to enable search. We use embeddings. So we use, rather than doing like lexical search over that collection of documents, we just throw them all through a small language model. I believe here it's Ada on OpenAI, an earlier GPT model. And we just store all of those vector representations of our documents, and then we can query those really quickly. There are specialized databases for this, specialized data structures. We're using an in-memory vector store called Feist here, but there's better options available. I use Pinecone for a more serious application that I developed. So then we're ready to go. LangChain comes with basically a prefabbed prompt for Q&A with sources. So I don't even need to do prompt engineering. I think doing some prompt engineering and doing some fine tuning are how you would take this up to the next level. Is something you can actually ship. But LangChain gives you an existing prompt that you can review and update, and a chain of language model invocations that can use that prompt to solve a particular task. And that's incredible for just getting going. Like many website templates, they aren't going to make your website stand out, but they are going to make your website stand up. And you need that to get started at the beginning. So this chain here uses our OpenAI LLM to answer questions about LangChain by looking in the documentation that I pulled down. So let's see what happens. What is LangChain? Hope it's not a blockchain-based language learning technology, or it's going to turn out that my presentation was completely incorrect up to this point. Okay, LangChain is a library that assists in the development of applications that use large language models. Yes, it provides modules, use cases, and guidance for creating applications such as agents, chatbots, question answering, summarization, and more. So yeah, that's a pretty good answer. I don't know. I guess I'm kind of automating myself out of the job here. Let the record show that's where I started, automating myself out of the job. And we got these sources here which point us to the LangChain documentation where we can read more about that answer. So that's nice. And you can actually, just to show that you can actually see that prompt template here, you can find what this sort of like few shot question answering prompt looks like. Pretty cool. I set this, I was originally going to demo my own code, and then I was like, I bet I could show it better if I just wrote out a really simple thing in a Jupyter notebook. And yeah, this took me like an hour to put together, and it's like low key kind of useful. What is LangChain Hub? I'm not super clear on what the LangChain Hub is, and it will give me an answer. So it's like pretty easy to deliver small amounts of value with LLMs by building these apps quickly with LangChain. Yeah, so I'm going to go ahead and Harrison, invite you up on the stage here. So let's see. Yeah, I got you.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks for making LangChain. I think that's the first thing I want to say.
No, you explained it a lot better than I ever could. So we got to record that and get that as the official pitch.
Nice. I guess I'll kick things off a little bit to start. I guess, Harrison, what do you think are some of the ways LangChain can be used like right now to deliver value, demonstrate the applicability of LLMs, and like actually get used in applications by small teams or individuals?
Yeah, I think probably the best one is chat over your documents. So building on top of this, so I'd say this is question answering over your documents. But if you think about Chat GPT or any of or some of the post stuff that Quora is launching, chat-based interfaces over specific things. And so I think the chat
Mm,
interface and the back and forth that it allows is just a little bit natural than less just like a query box. I think you see that
yeah.
with the explosion of Chat GPT, right? So I think even yesterday we put out something. We always had like chat LangChain, which is chat over our documentation. So taking exactly what you
Mhm.
did, adding a chat element to it. And there's some other things there as well that you can add, like streaming. And this gets to a lot of the points where you're saying, or that you were saying earlier, you don't need to know about transformers to implement streaming. In fact, that's probably a very different set of people. But yeah, I think that's
Mhm.
probably like the immediate thing that you can get up and started. And that's an open source repo that you can like clone and play around with.
Got it. Yeah, I actually want to double click on the question of the interface for these things. It's obvious to me that chat actually is the right interface, because it seems like if you stand up a generally capable chatbot next to I don't know, a down market search engine and allow people to chat with something, they end up having very strange conversations about things like whether they should break up with their spouse or, yeah, whether they live in a simulation. So it seems like the chat interface is like a little bit underdetermined right now with the way language models behave, and seems like higher risk with these feedback loops between the user and the chatbot in a way that feels like for most applications you maybe want to close that off. It's awesome that those things exist and people should be out there like exploring capabilities and like engaging in these kinds of unhinged conversations, but I don't know that I want that in my support chat.
Yeah, I think it is possible to keep them somewhat on track and focused on, like, the conversation at hand. To your point around what you said earlier around, like, prompt engineering and swapping out prompts, like, that's where that will come into play, and so it is a little bit extra work to do that, but I think and you can break them as well. There's a lot of viral stuff going on Twitter where you can break the chat things to do whatever you want. So one, I agree that, like, long term, there's probably better UXs than chat, but I think the moment that's the immediate thing that you can stand up super easily without a lot of extra work. In 6 months, do I expect chat to be, like, the best UX? Probably not, but I think, like, right now, if it's what's the thing that you can build at the moment to deliver value, it's probably that.
Got it. I agree, and I appreciate that. Yeah, that longer view. One thing that Nat Friedman has said about Copilot is that they had this awesome demo in the weekend, right? They just sat down and connected much earlier GPT models to code and had it like do auto completion, code synthesis from scratch, have it like they had a chat interface. They tried like every modality. And then from there to having something that they were willing to GA was 6 months or more, and not for reasons of, oh, enterprises move slow and you got to get everybody to agree, or, oh, we got to implement all these features. It was sort of like core figuring out what the UX was and understanding what's going to work well, what are people going to like, what is going to be sticky and people will actually continue to use. So I'm curious, like around things like prompt engineering to reduce hallucinations and keep models on track, or improving user experience from that like first wow demo that screenshots well in cherry picked examples but has downsides. Like, what do you think LangChain provides to help cover that, like to help make that leap faster, to maybe make shorter than 6 months and more like a few weeks?
So my background's in ML ops and stuff like that. On one hand, I kind of hope that there's a very quantitative and systematic approach that we can take to basically when you think about going from demos to production, there's like a few different things. One's at the system level and reducing the latency and deploying it. But then there's also this question around UX. And related to the UX is like the question about the quality of the model. And so I think that question about the
Hmm.
quality of the model and getting the quality of the model to that performance is the part that like I'm most interested in. And I was talking with someone the other day who has been building with these things for a while, like maybe 2 years or something at this point. And what this really boils down to is like, how do you evaluate and how do you know like whether you're making like progress in the right direction? And the way that he still does it at the moment is by kind of like looking just by like testing out different variants of the prompt and then seeing what the results. And he's gained like some intuition for this. And so one, I think like that's probably the best way to do it at the moment, if we're being 100% honest, is to like see like what's going on. And so some of the tools that we have in LangChain to help with that, for some of the notebook stuff, we like print out the intermediate steps in different colors to just let people see like what's going on at this step, what's going on at this step, so that you can get intuition and you can print out like the fully formed prompt. And then in more production use cases, we launched tracing, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, which basically allows you to visualize these traces in a UI component. And so you can easily like click through and dive into parts. And so that's probably like the first initial thing that we've got there is basically just making it easy to explore and gain intuition and see what's going on. And then we hope to add more over time to do more quantitative things around like evaluation so that you can try out, okay, what if I tweak this prompt in this way? Like what happens? Or what if I change this chain in this other way? What happens then? And that's on the roadmap and that's probably coming out in a few weeks or something like that.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll be looking forward to that. Yeah, and I think I also agree with you that right now it feels like, yeah, heuristic and holistic evaluation of language models is probably like what we have to do now. Defining the right metrics feels really challenging. For Copilot, it seems like the metric that they used was like user retention, which feels like a good metric to optimize. But I don't know that like Blue or like accuracy on some like small test set that you have or whatever is the right one. So like hooking into some sort of like A/B experimentation framework is, if we're thinking about what does this look like in 6 or 9 months when enterprises are doing this seriously in the way that they like to do it, that feels like a direction to resolve that tension between the need for metrics, the need for automation, and the inadequacy of most metrics for like understanding language model performance.
And I think another really interesting direction here is, like, using language models to do the evaluation themselves. And so there's some interesting research
Hmm.
papers by Anthropic about this, and there's actually some stuff already in LangChain around this specifically for question answering, because I think that's easier. That's like a more focused thing. And yeah, I think that that direction is like really interesting as well. Where basically instead of having a human kind of look at it and score it, you can ask a language model to do that, and you can just scale up the number of things that you can do.
The worry with doing that is this sort of Ouroboros problem of if the language models are being used to evaluate the language models.
Yeah.
Yeah, like ChatGPT's reward models, or the reward models using the InstructGPT series were small 6 billion parameter language models. I don't know that they're capable of determining the facticity of a statement or whether whether Python code has bugs in it. And so if you optimize for a reward model that doesn't include groundedness and facticity, then you get like way worse hallucinations. And maybe you optimize for highly confident, approximately correct answers and end up with a less useful chatbot. Some kind of user orientation, some kind of heuristic evaluation with humans, and some kind of like language model based automated system, like maybe application specific or use case specific, will be some like convex combination of those things for a language model. There was an interesting question from Andreas in the Q&A. They asked about how to combine few shot chain of thought prompting with retrieval augmentation. So chain of thought prompting is the like, let's think step by step. And retrieval augmentation is the term for what I just demoed. So where you like pull something from somewhere else and add it to your prompt. And Andreas is saying, oh yeah, I've tried these few shot chain of thought prompting, retrieve then read prompting, but they're saying that they run into like kind of the context limit when they're trying to like both do chain of thought reasoning and do sources in the same prompt. And of course, we're talking about not just chain of thought prompting, but like few shot chain of thought prompting, because in
Yeah.
general, like without a little bit of fine tuning or something, like chain of thought reasoning doesn't necessarily directly work. There, you need a little bit extra. And so you're running out of your token budget. For me, like my immediate thought on this is that maybe you need to fine tune to get good zero shot chain of thought prompting and then do retrieval augmentation to get your answers. And then you no longer need to use up half your prompt on few shot chain of thought. That's like my first guess from what I've seen people talk about from Illicit and from Ali Sabetz from Cohere, I think, is also a big advocate of fine tuning. Harrison, do you have any thoughts on how to combine few shot chain of thought prompting with retrieval augmentation, or maybe combining multiple techniques generally without hitting your prompt limit?
It depends a bit on the use case and what exactly the problem is, but one interesting thing to consider would be something where you're doing some, like, self-ask with search or self-ask with retrieval stuff, and what that does is it does the chain of thought or the self-ask. Self-ask is similar to chain of thought, but you think about what the intermediate steps you need to answer are, and then answer them, and
Mhm.
then go to the next intermediate step and then answer that. And so the self-ask with search, rather than doing that in all the same prompt, it comes up with the intermediate question that it needs to answer, and then it calls out to a different like API to get that answer. And what you could do is you
Mhm.
could put the retrieval augmented thing behind that API. So then you've got like one API that just does retrieval augmented generation, and you can use it to ask like
Mhm.
questions over LangChain docs. And then you've got another API which wraps it, and we call this like an agent in LangChain, and there's a pretty good framework for that. You can have the agent like break down the intermediate steps and then call out to that API, and so basically decompose it like separate concern.
Yeah, it seems like maybe there's a bit of a trade-off there, which is you can pay OpenAI more money by making more API calls, or you can stuff the prompt and try and get as much as you can in that one call. Maybe the like on an application specific level, you're going to make that trade-off call. Is it worth making 15 OpenAI API calls to answer a question with 5% more accuracy?
Yeah.
If you're a 911 operator, probably yes. If you're Q&A over a Discord channel, then probably.
Yep. I think that's fair.
Great. Another question coming in from Kaustu. Where does integration of LLMs with vision models stand? It seems like this would be an interesting area. Yeah, I haven't been paying as much attention to this spot as I was before, just because I've been like hardcore on just the language model side. But it seems like, we have clip and unclip. We have ways to integrate other modalities. You can just hand off base 64 encoded images to language models, and they can actually understand their content. That was an interesting demo. There's a bunch of like promising things here. Any of them that you want to call out, Harrison?
Yeah, so far, LangChain has not dipped into other, like, modalities, whether it be, like, speech or images. There is a PR open to add in basically, like, a Dolly API, so then you can start, like, generating images as part of a chain or something like that. And then, yeah, I think the next step would be if there is stuff to do around, like, putting the bytes back in the prompt or something like that. Yeah, I would expect
Hmm.
that to probably come out in, like, the next week or 2. So it's out there. We need to flesh it out, like, a little bit more, but it's definitely something that's underexplored, I would say. I also have not been exploring that space too much.
Yeah, it feels like just understanding what we can do with generic text to text maps is like just such a rich space
Yeah.
that like it feels reasonable to focus on that a little bit before like integrating vision, and maybe integrating speech even feels like a sort of slightly safer first thing to do, because like you can just treat it as like all audio and all speech becomes text, and you don't have to worry about like how do I embed music or how do I handle dogs barking or whatever. And so you keep that you're just thinking about language, but you still add another modality.
And I think when we do images as well, that's generally how we'll treat it. Like, I think what you're saying is like audio can be at the start of something and then you can and then you can make it to text. And I guess you could have something that basically putting it as like at the bookend, but then having the central logic be the language model. And the bookend could be
Yeah.
generating images or generating audio or going from audio to text or images to text, I guess, as well. There's some of the document loaders have to do with like PDFs and other things like that.
Question coming in from my former coworker, Scott Condren at WNB. Yeah, would you mind sharing your thoughts on the best tooling out there for understanding LLMs and using them in your workflow? What kinds of tooling do you want to see in the future? So I'll just say that like the first thing that comes to mind for me is tracing stuff that is in LangChain. There's also other tools like ICE from Elicit. They're kind of like trace viewers for your LM programs, right? They focus on which executions, which inputs, which outputs are of most interest. They display them in a useful way, like a flame graph shows a useful trace of a program, or the like Firefox profiler shows a useful trace of what happened when you interacted with a website. That's the most obvious, like super useful tool. I don't know, Harrison, if you have any thoughts on this, or like maybe something around like visualizing prompts or visualizing experiments with prompts, or like metrics for experiments over prompts. I don't know.
So I'm not going to say anything in LangChain because that'd be too biased, but I think the ICE primer stuff is really, really awesome. And I think to the point around
Hmm.
visualizing prompts, like I think they do let you do that when you click into like the trace at a certain point. And then for like visualizing metrics over prompts, I don't think there's any great tools for that out there yet. So I would say definitely like the ICE primer stuff. And yeah, to be honest, like we chatted with the folks at Elicit and they're awesome. And like a lot of the inspiration for the tracing, like very similar ideas there. And so I think that those types of tools are much.
Got it. Yeah. It feels like there's like this blocker on how to visualize text that's on the order of like hundreds to thousands of tokens, right? Because
Yeah.
like you can't really show it in a normal, like you want to show it in a database, but like databases, it's row oriented and you see like one line of text and it's like useless. We normally show extended amounts of text with things like books, pieces of paper, and it's like we don't really actually have that good of a visualization for this, aside from things like coloring templated prompts in a way that highlights templating, or like changing colors of prompts to say, oh, this one came from an intermediate step. Just the raw visualization of medium size amounts of text is one of the blockers on making these tools like really productivity enhancing and useful.
Yeah, no, I mean, honestly, you just gave us a great feature suggestion with that highlighting the blocks of text from that come from different variables. I think we have a variant of that. You can like in the step up, they're separate things and then they get combined in the prompt. And so if you switch between them, but having them more tightly coupled, very good idea. We're gonna go do that.
Yeah, DM me and we can spec that feature out. Let's see. So we got another question from Cowstib, and I think this will be our last question just because I planned this for 30 to 45 minutes. Don't want to hold people for too long. So are there any applications that are being developed focused on explainability of LLMs? So I know that like folks at Anthropic really care deeply about this, explainability and interpretability. And I generally agree with their position that this is not something that can be solved with like Shapley values or feature explanations, or like any sort of like off the shelf thing, that it's more of a like a research problem that involves like carefully decompiling and reverse engineering transformers. There's promising stuff out of DeepMind around like the other direction, which is like writing code that is compiled into transformers, which is with Tracker and Raspberry. All very researchy, like not something that it's, without having a dedicated MLR with that as one of their projects, hard to incorporate into an LLM application. That group is spinning off some visualizations that help with explainability, like ways to visualize text that shows like other highly ranked tokens during a generation, or like visualizes just the logic values, like PySfelt and stuff for kind of integrating dynamic JavaScript powered visualizations with stuff where the actual raw data is coming from Python. That's one place to go to look for the raw materials of doing explainability. So that's my perspective. Harrison, you got any thoughts on this one?
Honestly, this is probably a question that I don't have the best knowledge to answer. So I think honestly, your answer sounded better than anything I could come up with. So I'm not going to try to add to it.
Got it. Yeah, I imagine people ask about, yo, where's the dot explain? Where's my SQL query explain, but for LangChain, right? So what do you do when, or do you have a response or an issue that you point them to for, here's LangChain's thoughts on explainability and why it is or isn't on the roadmap or where it is?
I think if you're talking about like explaining the chain as a whole or the agent as a whole, I think I would probably say like tracing and support around that is probably our answer for that. And then for like the specific components, and so like for specific components around like explainability of a language model, I view those as slightly separate, basically. And I think could it make sense down the road to integrate some of that? Absolutely. Will we be the ones building that? Probably not. Again, given like I think LangChain is like a developer framework, and I think a lot of the tools we're adding are more on that side. And I think especially for like language models, like I chatted with one friend at like MIT yesterday, and this is like his research group, what they're working on. It's a little bit different than like our focus.
Yeah, separation of concerns is a good idea. So one person, M. Roman, asked, what is a good conference to attend in order to become familiar with the LLM research community? So I actually don't know of a good conference. There is the Full Stack Deep Learning LLM Bootcamp, which I just wanted to pitch one last time. There's a call to action, little button at the bottom of your screens that's a link for this. We will put this material online in some form shortly after it comes out if you can't make it to San Francisco at the end of April. Harrison will be giving a talk there, which is going to be really exciting. Looking forward to that. I believe we just announced that Peter Wellender from OpenAI will also be giving a talk there. So it's not just going to be us at FSDL explaining things. We'll also have some of the core builders and operators in the space there. So that's going to be, I think that's going to be a great opportunity. Looking forward to it a lot, especially given how wonderful it's been to talk about this stuff with Harrison now. So yeah, thanks a lot, Harrison, for coming today and for making a really awesome library that has allowed me to make a bunch of dumb little language model widgets to play with.
Thanks for having me, Charles. This is awesome, and really looking forward to the bootcamp. I think that should be.
Take care, everyone, and we will see you out and about.